West Bank, where the sun sets, the necropolises, the temples, the pyramids. This is the city of the dead. On the bank where the sun rises, the cities of the living sprawl out. Cairo is 1,000 years old. The metropolis of the Nile, which has grown into Africa's largest city, has burst at every seam, even spanning the river. Buildings were erected in haste. Bridges and walkways are suspended over the streets. Today, Cairo has a population of 13 million, and it increases by nearly 1 million people a year. By the year 2000, at this rate of growth, the town will have to house and feed 20 million men and women in a space hemmed in by 2 deserts. 15% more vehicles every year despite the recent construction of an underground railway. Pollution is among the worst in the world. Nonetheless, it's a human city, with a welcoming hustle and bustle, generally peaceful, but also just as liable to explode at any moment. Every day, 40,000 children go out to pick up refuse around the city, loading up their donkey carts. A whole corporation of rag and bone merchants of school age. From Tahrir to the old Muslim Khan al-Khalili district, teacher rubbed shoulder with fellah, the poor with the rich, shopkeeper with civil servant. After lecturing, a university professor may become a taxi driver or a shopkeeper. Survival is what it's all about. In 1983, the Khan al-Khalili district and the Muslim University of Al-Azhar were celebrating their millennium. Al-Azhar the Brilliant was founded at a time when neither the University of Oxford nor the Sorbonne existed. Today, education in Egypt is free of charge. There are 10 million school-age children in the country, nearly 25% of the population. The West Bank, Al-Giza, Cairo's residential suburb, going right out to the pyramids. Amid the traffic jams, thousands of people come here every day to relax among the camel drivers, the horsemen, the cabs and buses, full with tourists from Europe, America, Japan, or Saudi Arabia. A somewhat laughable masquerade where foreigners don't really recognize their pyramids. But the superb necropolises of Kefren, Mycerinos, and particularly Cheops have been preserved, almost miraculously. Cheops, the world's most impressive tomb, built 4,600 years ago on the orders of a megalomaniac pharaoh conscious of his power and his immortality, God on earth. 450 feet high, 2,300,000 blocks of granite, a beam of petrified light carrying the pharaoh after his death up to the sun. Secret passages lead to an inside corridor up to the chamber belonging to the queen, then a long gallery leading to the king's funeral chamber. It is said that for the Egyptians, the Great Pyramid served as an initiation temple, or even an astronomical observatory. In fact, it was the dwelling place of eternity, desired to be inviolable, but plundered from the earliest times. Inside, nothing. Not a single inscription. Only an empty sarcophagus, doubtlessly profaned ages ago. Is this the sarcophagus of Pharaoh Cheops? No one can be sure. Then, where would the real royal chamber be? Believing that they had discovered abnormalities in the layout of the galleries and the chambers, some French architects made drill holes in the walls. They discovered cavities, but these turned out to be filled up with sand. Afterwards, other openings were studied by Japanese researchers. Americans were to follow, then Argentinians. The secret of the pyramids still remains an enigma. Abu Sir, south of Giza, a 5th dynasty monument. Meidum, a stepped pyramid ascribed to King Snefru, and the most ancient stone monument in the world, the Saqqara Pyramid, built by the architect Imhotep 4,700 years ago. For centuries, there were to be dug out in the shadows of the pharaoh's tombs the burial places, the mastabas, of the nobles and high-ranking dignitaries. In 1860, the French archaeologist Mariette discovered in Saqqara a superb mastaba of Ti, high priest of the temples under King Nuseri. In the inside chamber, the walls are covered with frescoes, painted 2,500 years before Christ. Shipbuilding, hunting scenes, fishing, and offerings on incredibly well-preserved bas-reliefs. A hippopotamus hunting scene in a clump of papyrus. As he comes through, wounded by 2 spears, the hippopotamus snaps at a crocodile. Carving up an antelope, using flint knives. The hieroglyphics all around provide the details. In the mastaba of Tahotep, the ancient inspector of the royal pyramids, was found an unbelievable scene of a bird hunt. The hunters, lying on their backs, energetically tightened the net, while others lay hand on geese and wild ducks. A procession of donkeys being led to sacrifice. At the time, it was thought that the donkey was in cahoots with Seth, representing the forces of evil. A cattle herd moves along his beasts, one of which has been subjected to the ritual distorting of the horns. Cattle were often depicted with irony, even if man was seen carrying the younger animals on his back to ford a river. A bearer of offerings. And in the shipyard of the ancient empire, papyrus boats were built. At that time, there was a proliferation of papyrus along the banks of the Nile. Papyrus even became the symbol of Lower Egypt. The delta swampland was fished using draw nets, hoop nets, landing nets. And in the dense vegetation, on the banks, various types of hunting went on, with harpoons or boomerangs being used. Papyruses grew 10 feet tall. They have now totally disappeared, with the exception of a few experimental plantations. In the past, papyrus was used for building huts, making boats or ropes. Paper was made from papyrus fiber. It was cut up, laid out in 2 layers, and then crushed with a mallet. These sheets were rot-proof and could stand up to the weathering of millennia, and lend themselves to the writing of men, or for messages to the gods. On the day of the Last Judgment, Anubis and Tot were weighing hearts. Nothing shall be forgotten, as the ancient texts have it. Those who arrive here stainless shall be like the gods, masters of eternity. Erected above the chaos of the world, temples were also designed to last an eternity. At Thebes, the capital of the new empire, 40 rams sitting like sphinxes guard the temple of Ammon, the uncreated creator. To get into the temple, one went through porches and pylons until one reached the sanctuary. Only the pharaoh and the priests were the uncreated creator. To get into the temple, one went through porches and pylons until one reached the sanctuary. Only the pharaoh and the priests were allowed through this forest of pillars. There are 134 of them, like giant trees, supporting the heavens. On every pillar, sovereigns identified with gods, gods symbolizing kings, sometimes shown in the form of a vulture, like the goddess Nikbet. Scenes of grandeur, obelisks, statues of dozens of generations of pharaohs were put on show in Karnak for over 2,000 years, so that they should last as long as the heavens. But since these ancient times, at least 5,000 years ago, the Egyptian pyramid has rested on the peasant masses, despite the invasions of Asians, Greeks, Romans, and Arabs, and the slow emergence of modern technologies. Egypt, a gift of the Nile? A gift of the fellahs, more likely. In this desert land irrigated by a single river, the peasant folk have always been compelled to take water right to their fields, ever higher, ever further, using the antiquated shaduf or the sakye, driven by a blind steer. Irrigation, digging canals, maintaining the dikes, mixing silt into the earth, acts as old as Egypt itself. The Fellah still blames the high Aswan Dam for the disappearance of silt for the incredible proliferation of the water hyacinths. A purple and acid green plant which is born, lives and multiplies on the banks of the Nile and its canals, so prolifically that it has to be relentlessly weeded out. After the yearly floods, black mud covered the valley floor with a fertile layer of earth. It was this silt that led to the ancient Egyptians referring to this habitable area as the Black Lands, in opposition to the red sands of the desert. Rice paddies have replaced the barley fields of ancient Egypt. The linen, figuring on frescoes, has given way to cotton and sugarcane. Long fiber cotton, one of the world's best, one of the most demanding, too, for care and labor. At cleansing and picking time, thousands of children are brought by their teachers into the fields. Children, say the fellas, come into the world with their loaves of bread under their arms. They are 10, perhaps 12 years old, and are helping to harvest the sugarcane under the watchful eye of the owner. With the other fellahs, these country children feed over half of their overpopulated Egypt and account for 70% of its exports. Reaping corn, threshing, were formerly considered to be religious acts. Just like the fisherman, heading fish back into his deep nets. Egypt, the eternal. The Aswan Dam is also thought to have fostered the development of a parasite which is very widespread in stagnant waters, bilharzia. Water that the fellas never filter in order not to deprive it of its life. The children bathe in it, women wash their linen in it, and do the washing up, beside the water buffaloes. Hospitable, generous people, although they often live below the poverty line. Families, just as in the past, still feed on beans, salted cheese, raw onions, fruit, and a little round loaf baked at home, which is given a name of pharaonic origin, the Tau. A family numbering 15 to 20 people is housed in 3 rooms of the clay house. For space is in short supply, and the family numerous. The authorities of both Muslim and Coptic Christians have prohibited birth control, and each year sees an extra 1 million Egyptians to house. Housing, the never-ending problem. The Nile silt, the giver of all. Fertility of the soil and the walls of houses. Throughout the countryside, there operate hundreds of craft industries, producing bricks made of mud and straw. Here again, children constitute most of the labor force, for a ridiculous salary. And the Nile silt, ever harder to come by, is still the raw material for the brickworks, despite the bans in force. On both sides of the Nile and along its canals stand Egypt's 14,000 hamlets and villages. Villages sometimes with illuminated walls, as if the Egyptians had memories of their artistic past. Only the gods have changed. The symbols, the hieroglyphics, and more than anything else, the style. Late afternoon, the village comes alive. Time for a chicha, a water pipe, and a meeting of friends. Big puffs of Persian tobacco, sometimes laced with a pinch of hashish. The pipe goes from mouth to mouth because chicha smoking is a ritual. Smokers on one side, spectators on the other. The women are at home. The rule is to talk loudly and on every subject: war, sports, politics, and usually with a touch of humor. How many Egyptians have changed the world by smoking a chicha? Some villages have water supply and electricity. Once a week it is market day. Chickens, ducks, fresh fruit and vegetables change hands. On such a day, a fella may spend all his year's savings to buy a goat. In ancient Thebes, Luxor, Karnak, and the small villages along the West Bank, life is no longer regulated by the Nile floodwaters, but by the great religious feast days. Muslim, Coptic, celebrations, sometimes ones of centuries-old origin. Fellahs and fellahas crowd in, craftspeople, traders, livestock merchants. It's the great gathering. For 5 days, Luxor becomes the center of attraction for the whole of the Upper Valley. From far-off Aswan in the south, from Asyut in the north, every year the crowd is denser. Over the last 10 years, Egypt has witnessed an unprecedented upward surge of the Islamic religion. The Temple of Luxor is over 3,000 years old. For the great pharaonic feast of Opet, the golden statue of the god Ammon was taken there from Karnak on a sacred boat. In the 13th century, the Muslims erected a mosque in the precincts of the old sanctuary itself, in honor of Sheikh Abu al-Agag. Thus was sealed the final vanquishment of Luxor by the new religion. Since then, every year, the fair has set up its rusty swings at the foot of the colossuses of Ramses. For Islam in Egypt is on all sides, ever within reach of the masses, whether young or old. For Islam in Egypt is on all sides, ever within reach of the masses, whether young or old. According to belief, Saint Abu al-Agag was drawn up one night at full moon to the heavens to have bestowed upon him knowledge and the precepts of the Holy War. To remember this event, at the foot of his tomb, the members of the Rifariya Brotherhood subject themselves to trial by single combat, the baton dance. Allah's horsemen arriving from Palestine in 636, swarming over Egypt, which they took 3 years to conquer. Egyptian Coptic Christians were converted. Others resisted and maintained their Christian faith, but they had to pay tax. Since that time, muted hostility has at all times divided the two communities. The Muslims themselves have witnessed dissensions between the partisans of the Umayyads and the Fatimids, Sunnites and Shiites. Under varying flags, the clans, on this day of celebration, have come together, burying their differences. And symbolically, the young take up arms. On the day of the great procession, over 15,000 pilgrims come to accompany floats on the water carrying the saints' numerous descendants. Sacred boats. Might not the pilgrimage be a relic from the feast of Opet, which took place on this very spot 3,000 years ago? Departing from the Pharaonic temple, the procession goes off through town. Carrying embroidered, decorated canopies in the colors of the 8 brotherhoods, dromedaries blend their bleating with the chants and drum rolls around them. The religious aspect of the procession is basically in the hands of the menfolk. With their encouragements, the children and the women do take part. But only the men can recite the Burda, a poem to the glory of God. Legend would have it that Abu al-Agag indulged in a mystic form of Islamic worship, Sufism. One day he decided to abandon the realities of the world and leave for the desert before withdrawing to Mecca. Sufism still has its adepts. In the night, in the mosque, every initiation brotherhood gathers around the tomb of the saint for Quranic chants and recitations. Advocating a return to simplicity, opposing our world to the world as it should be, and tirelessly repeating the name of Allah. Right up to the final stages, late in the night, the Sikher dance, an invocation, an incantation, rhythmic movements until ecstasy is almost reached. On the other bank of the Nile, near the mountain of Thebes, the colossuses of Memnon have been keeping watch for 3,400 years. In the Theban mountains, interspersed with valleys and passes, are an immense complex of royal tombs and sanctuaries. At Deir al-Bahari, the temple of Queen Hatshepsut stands against the cliff with its terraces, its ramps, its archways, pure lines along a revolutionary plan, the fruit of the imagination of an inspired architect, Senenmut. In one wing of the building, he erected a chapel to the glory of Hathor, the goddess of love. Hatshepsut, the pharaoh queen, unchallenged sovereign of Egypt, 14 centuries before Cleopatra. The walls of the chapel tell the processions and festivities which she organized. A dream brought her an order to conduct a divine mission. Amon commanded her to fit out her ships and send them to the land of Punt. Thus, 1,500 years before Christ, Queen Hatshepsut organized an incredible sea expedition, which was to bring back gold, incense and myrrh, indispensable adjuncts for the purposes of worship. The Theban mountain, the summit of the west, in its valleys houses hundreds of tombs of kings, queens, nobles, craftsmen. But in the rocky mountainside, a host of dark holes lead to innumerable burial places. The lowly also aspire to eternity. In these holes there lie, side by side, the remains of the poorest of mummies. In the Valley of the Queens there lie the wives of the pharaohs together with a few princes of royal blood. Tiny tombs, such as the tomb of one of Ramesses III's sons, where a ray of sunlight, reflected off mirrors, lights up the deepest of its galleries. In the funerary chamber, astonishingly fresh paintings describe the offerings made by the gods before the strange silhouette of the prince, still with his infant plaids. Tot, with his ibis's head, the master of wisdom, the defied pharaoh, Osiris with his green face, green, the color of resurrection. The whole of the very complicated mythology by which the ancient Egyptians attempted to reassure themselves, faced with the mysteries of life, and, even more so, of death. Standing 36 feet deep in the Valley of the Nobles, the tomb of Sennefer, mayor of Thebes under Pharaoh Amenphis II of the 18th dynasty. The vine tomb, symbol of life, for a single vine stalk springing from the earth made it possible to increase and multiply the bunches of grapes until they reached the sky. the vine arbor, there took place a ceremony to lead Senefer and his spouse to immortality. Senefer was depicted wearing a panther skin, the dress of a priest. Among the craftsmen, Senegem, the server of truth. At Deir el Medine, his little cave depicts him in the fields of Ialu, paradise. In order to deserve to live there, Senegem and his wife push the plow, reap the flax and the corn. The deceased is embalmed by Anubis, the god with the jackal's head, the master of the dead. Another great dignitary, Ramesses, the vizier, governor of the city under Amenphis IV, the future Akhenaton. Ramesses had depicted the faces of his relations, not in painting, but carved in slight relief in limestone. A hymn to the open eye. Much more ancient yet, the site of Abydos, where every mortal went in pilgrimage. As an object of worship, Osiris replaced the original gods. It is said that Osiris was killed by his brother Seth, and that here he experienced resurrection. In this esoteric place, the great pharaohs Seti I and Ramses II erected their temples. However, it was in Thebes that Seti I had his tomb dug, the most imposing one in the whole Valley of Kings, carved 400 feet into the mountain, but with a ceiling in the image of a sky. Seti I, the champion, the conqueror of the Hittites, who brought back prisoners from the Valley of the Orontes. Wearing a nemes on his head, his brow adorned with the uraeus, the sacred asp of protection, the pharaoh gives up his final destiny into the hands of the falcon-headed Horus. Right at the back of the king's tombs, there are sarcophaguses, like the tomb of Horemheb, the general who became a pharaoh, and sometimes mummies of unknown origins whom the Egyptologists have not been able to identify. In 1922, Howard Carter, the archaeologist, and Lord Carnarvon were luckier when, against all expectations, they discovered the treasures of Tutankhamun. A small tomb, almost intact, brimming over with objects of worship and funerary furnishings, including 2 statues made of black wood depicting the king himself. Effigies of goddesses of protection keeping watch over the canopic shrine, while in the triple sarcophagus, made of gold and semi-precious stones, lies the mask of the young pharaoh. However, a large number of other remarkable sculptures have been discovered in quartz, shale, or limestone, in the lineage of the great conquerors, Thutmosis III. Amenphis III, Akhenaton's father. Akhenaton, the non-violent instigator of a new religion devoted to Aton. A roll of papyrus on his knees, the architect Amenhotep in the paws of a scribe. The scribe was considered to be the eye, the ear, and the mouth of the king. Dating back to the Middle Empire, wooden statuettes of Egyptian and Nubian soldiers, as well as the statue of King Awibre. And more ancient yet, this effigy of falcon horse, made of gold and obsidian. A few miles from the Nile, the Libyan desert, the frontiers of the Sahara. A world of minerals, ripped peaks, salt outgrowths, the White Desert. Oases punctuate this sterile expanse: Siwa, Dakhla, Karga. A country fertile 5,000 years ago. The caravans from North Africa would stop there on their way to Mecca. These mud-walled villages have survived thanks to subterranean water, running deep but strong. The whole region could become a new valley after major development. Architecture, crafts. The traditions from nearby Libya persist. In certain families from the north of the valley, Siwi, a dialect of Berber origin, is still spoken. Egypt has an area of 470,000 square miles, but only 5% is habitable land. In the Red Sea deserts, 40,000 Bedouins still survive. It is expected that by the year 2000, there will be 2 million Egyptians in Sinai, in the wake of an ambitious irrigation project, a network of underground channels. Egypt, which has witnessed the construction of the pyramids, the Suez Canal, Lake Nasser and the dam, no longer knows where reality ends and dreaming begins. Oil sprang forth. The Aswan Dam flooded the formerly barren land and with a 10 million kilowatt-hour capacity brought electricity to half the country. On the Mediterranean seaboard, Alexandria deploys its 12 miles of rooftops along a pebbly beach. Egypt's second largest city, 3 million inhabitants, and a glorious past. But what remains of Alexandria's heritage? Under a Muslim fortress are buried the stones of the ancient lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the world. The library, the palaces were burnt. There remains the villa of King Farouk. Alexandria was a cosmopolitan town. Thousands of foreigners came together here. Greeks, Italians, English, Turks, or Syrians. Today, nearly all of them have left. Over a 25-year period, the population has doubled, but the grandiose schemes of Viceroy Muhammad Ali have faded into oblivion. Grandeur, romanticism. Egyptian cinema production is among the most prolific in the world. 2/3 of their feature films are musicals. Their stars, female singers. An industry that even the Egyptians called Lukum cinema. Over 50 feature films produced each year, and a real video boom against touching and populist backdrops.
نعم ما قلتليش عملت لي ايه في طلب السلفه بتاع البنك؟
للاسف يا زنكلوني اترفض.
اترفض يعني ايه يا استاذ؟
اترفض لانك انت ما قدمتش اي ضمان للقرض ده.
انزل. امال انت لازمتك ايه؟
اوكي مش اثبت.
What has become of the wild nights we heard so much about? When the rich of Alexandria or Cairo get together, particularly for a wedding, they hide under satin and coal. Women show off Oriental elegance. The hidden face of the Egyptians, pleasure. A sensual belly dance, known here as classical dancing. It was far from worldly pleasures that in the mountains of the eastern desert, as early as the 3rd century, Coptic monasticism was instituted. It is thought that St. Anthony, together with the hermit St. Paul, who was then 113 years of age, founded it. Probably St. Paul's monastery on the Red Sea is one of the most ancient in the world. The walls and buildings center on the grotto, where St. Paul lived for many long years, feeding each day on half a loaf of bread brought to him by a raven. This prestigious community attracts large crowds of faithful each Sunday. The Copts consider themselves to be the true heirs of the ancient Egyptians. There are 6 to 7 million Orthodox Copts under the leadership of their own Pope, Shenouda III, and they have not forgotten that the Holy Family passed through Egypt. Some practices seem to lie midway between religion and magic, such as the laying on of hands, which cures disease. Prayers, recited in the Coptic language, are expressed in formulae, incantations, and postures, prostrations rather than genuflections.
Would
vigor being experienced by Islam in Egypt coincides with the movement towards Christian renewal. For the last 20 years, the Coptic Church has seen an upsurge in vocations. The monastery of St. Macarius had only 6 monks left in 1970. Today, they number several dozen, mostly coming from universities. The stringency of the rule, common to all the churches of the East, enforces fasting, lengthy prayers, and a meal of cheese and eggs with the community. However, to see a gathering of Christians in Egypt, it is not a place that needs choosing, but rather a time. The time of the great religious feast days. In the Deir Dronka monastery in Middle Egypt, pilgrims flock in by the thousands to celebrate the feast of Mary. For 3 long days, the festivities will enable the crowd to liberate forces pent up over the whole year. The ritual sacrificing of goats and sheep, supervised by the Reverend Father Butcher. Scenes of devotion. Collective baptism. After being confirmed, the young Christian dresses in white and wears a mitre on his head. A week later, during the untying of the belt ritual, this garb will be removed. Finally, the procession gets underway. Deacons are dressed in white, and in a cloud of incense, the higher-ranking priests are dressed in black. Amid this crowd is revealed Egypt's other face, minorities in a Muslim world. 7 million Copts are laying claim to an identity. What will be the tomorrows of the Nile?